My name is Jenna Patterson, and I was 32. The morning my family openly laughed at my inheritance. I sat in a mahogany-lined law office in downtown Chicago and watched my mother receive a sprawling estate, my brother receive a $2 million trust, and my sister receive a portfolio of vacation homes. The lawyer handed me a single sealed white envelope. Inside was a blank card with a 10-digit phone number printed on it. No money, no property, just a local 312 area code. For 5 years, I had driven out to Oak Brook every single weekend to manage my grandfather's failing health, reconcile his medical bills, and run his household, while my family took ski trips to Aspen and ignored his calls. And there they were grinning across the table, whispering that Grandpa must have left me the number to a local homeless shelter. They thought I had sacrificed my 20s for free. They thought I was the punchline. They were wrong. What I did next changed the financial reality of our family forever. Welcome back to Calm Senior Stories, where the quiet people in the room finally balance the ledger and let the receipts do the talking. If you appreciate stories about boundaries, sharp justice, and the power of walking away, you are in the right place. Drop your age in the comments so I know who is listening, and subscribe so you never miss a detail. That morning in the lawyer's office smelled like old paper and expensive leather. Rain hit the high windows overlooking the city. I am a corporate compliance auditor. My entire career is built on sitting in quiet rooms and finding the exact numbers people are trying to hide. I am used to silence, but the silence in that room was heavy. My mother Susan sat in the center of the leather sofa, wearing a black dress she bought specifically to look like a grieving widow, though she had not visited her own father in 6 months. My older brother Tyler sat to her left, checking his phone every 3 minutes. My younger sister Brittany sat on the right, twisting a diamond ring around her finger. The lawyer, a stern man in his 60s, read through my grandfather Richard's directives. The numbers were staggering. Tyler was awarded a clean $2 million trust to fund what he called his entrepreneurial spirit. Susan was handed the deed to the Oak Brook estate, a property worth millions on its own. Brittany secured the deeds to the lake houses. Every time a new asset was announced, a subtle wave of relief and triumph washed over the sofa. Then the lawyer picked up a plain white envelope. He cleared his throat, avoiding my eyes. He said Richard had specific instructions for me. He handed it across the desk. I broke the seal. A heavy piece of cardstock slid out. It held nothing but a phone number. Brittany leaned over to look. She let out a sharp, poorly stifled laugh. She nudged Tyler and whispered loud enough for the entire room to hear that it was probably a hotline for a grief counselor, or maybe a local shelter, since I was about to be broke. Tyler smirked, keeping his eyes on his screen. Susan gave me a pitying look, the kind you give a stray dog, and patted her designer handbag. They saw me exactly how they had always seen me. I was the reliable, expendable helper. When Grandpa got sick 5 years ago, the logistics fell to me. I was the one who fought with the insurance companies, managed the property taxes, and sat in the sterile waiting rooms. I did it because it was the right thing to do. My family viewed my sacrifice as a lack of ambition. They assumed I hovered around Grandpa because I had no life of my own. Sitting in that office looking at the blank card, they felt validated. They had the wealth. I had a piece of paper. I looked at the phone number. I recognized the 312 area code. I felt the familiar, steady calm that washes over me right before I finalize an audit. I did not cry. I did not yell at Brittany for her cruel joke. I did what an auditor does. I followed the paper trail. I set the crisp white card on the polished mahogany desk. The paper felt heavy, carrying a weight only I seemed to understand. Across the room, Brittany was still giggling, leaning into Tyler's shoulder. Tyler had already opened a browser on his smartphone, his thumbs moving rapidly as he likely priced out luxury vehicles. Susan adjusted her posture on the center cushion, smoothing the dark fabric of her skirt, ready to wrap up the meeting and dismiss me. They were already spending their inheritances in their heads. I reached into my wool coat pocket and pulled out my phone. I tapped the 10 digits exactly as they appeared on the card. I did not hold the device to my ear. I placed it flat on the leather writing pad right next to the envelope and pressed the speaker button. The dial tone hummed loud and clear, filling the quiet office. The local estate lawyer looked up from his stack of folders. His eyes darted from my phone down to the card resting on his desk. I watched his shoulders stiffen. He recognized the area code. He recognized the specific exchange. A man in his position knows the phone numbers that move the real money in this city. The line rang once. A crisp, highly professional woman answered before the second ring could even finish. Harrison Wealth Management Private Client Division. How may I direct your call? The name hung in the air like a dropped weight. Harrison Wealth Management is not a neighborhood credit union. You do not walk into their marble lobby to open a standard checking account. They handle generational portfolios, the kind of ultra-high net worth accounts that build hospital wings and fund university endowments. Tyler's head snapped up from his screen. His thumbs stopped moving. Brittany stopped twisting her diamond ring. "This is Jenna Patterson," I said, keeping my voice steady and level, utilizing the exact tone I use during hostile corporate audits. The woman on the other end did not hesitate or ask for an account number. "One moment, Ms. Patterson. I will connect you with your primary director." Hold music played for exactly 3 seconds. A male voice clicked onto the line, sharp, practiced, and deeply serious. "Ms. Patterson, my name is David Vance. I have been expecting your call. Before we proceed with the transfer of authority, I need the verbal authorization phrase your grandfather provided to you." I thought back to my final real conversation with Grandpa Richard. We were sitting in the quiet enclosure of his sunroom. He was struggling to breathe, the oxygen machine humming in the background, but his mind was as sharp as broken glass. He had always been a shark in business, a man who built a logistics empire from a single warehouse. He noticed everything. He noticed who showed up to read his medical charts, and he noticed who only called on his birthday to ask for early distributions. He had grabbed my hand with surprising strength and whispered a phrase I assumed was just a fevered piece of advice. Now, sitting in the law office, I understood it was a key. I spoke the words into the silent room. "The ledger always balances." "Identity confirmed," David said. His voice echoed off the wood paneling, impossible to ignore. "Richard's instructions were precise, and they take effect immediately upon this verification. As of this exact moment, you are the sole trustee of the Patterson Family Trust. Furthermore, you are now the controlling shareholder of the primary holding company." The silence in the law office turned solid. No one took a breath. Susan blinked, her mouth parting slightly, the performative grief vanishing from her features. I looked at the lawyer across the desk. He refused to meet my gaze, staring intently at the legal pad in front of him. He knew this was coming. My grandfather had orchestrated this secondary layer of security entirely outside of this local firm, bypassing the local attorney to ensure no one in the family could interfere. "To clarify your legal position, Ms. Patterson," David continued, pacing his words so they carried maximum impact. "The specific inheritances outlined in the preliminary will reading taking place today, the real estate portfolio, the liquid trusts, and the physical properties are not independent assets. They are conditional subsidiaries nested entirely within your primary trust." I watched my family process the terminology. Tyler is not an intellectual man, but he understands the word conditional. The $2 million he thought he owned free and clear did not belong to him. It belonged to the holding company. The Oakbrook estate Susan thought she secured was a subsidiary property. The vacation homes Brittany planned to leverage were legally tethered to my signature. I owned the umbrella. They were simply standing underneath it, waiting for the rain. "Your grandfather structured the estate so that no subsidiary distributions can occur without your explicit ongoing consent," David explained over the speakerphone, his voice carrying the finality of a gavel striking wood. "You have solely discretionary authority over their release. The beneficiaries have no legal recourse to bypass your approval." Brittany's face went pale. The cruel smirk she wore just 3 minutes ago was gone, replaced by a slack jaw and wide, panicked eyes. Tyler dropped his smartphone onto the leather couch cushion. It landed with a dull thud. Susan gripped the handles of her designer handbag so tight her knuckles turned white. The smug arrogance that defined their existence was evaporating in real time. The private banker did not stop. He was a man dealing with high-level financial logistics, unconcerned with the emotional wreckage happening in our local office. Which brings us to immediate business. David said, the sound of a keyboard clacking softly in the background on his end of the line. The subsidiary beneficiaries have already submitted requests for preliminary disbursements this coming Friday. Your brother has initiated a wire transfer request for a luxury vehicle lease. Your sister has attempted to process a deposit for a destination wedding venue. Your mother has scheduled a bulk withdrawal for estate renovations. They had wasted no time. They had started spending the money the second they thought Grandpa Richard was close to the end. They operated on the assumption that the wealth was guaranteed, treating the funds like a bottomless well that required zero effort to maintain. Do you wish to authorize their funds for Friday, Ms. Patterson? David asked, his tone polite but firm. Or freeze the subsidiary accounts pending your formal review. The room stopped breathing. Susan looked at me. For the first time in my entire life, she was not looking at a dependable helper. She was not looking at the quiet daughter she could manipulate into doing her heavy lifting. She was looking at a wall she could not climb. I sat in the leather chair, feeling the weight of the last 5 years settle into its rightful place. I thought about the late nights sorting out Medicare supplement plans. I thought about the dates I canceled to wait for the visiting nurses. I thought about the holidays spent alone in hospital cafeterias, while my mother and siblings drank champagne in ski resorts, refusing to answer my updates about Richard's declining heart rate. They had treated my kindness like an endless subscription they never had to pay for. They thought Grandpa's silence over their absence meant he did not care. They failed to realize that men who build empires do not yell when they are disappointed. They simply rewrite the contracts. Tyler opened his mouth to speak, his hands shaking slightly. Susan raised a hand, silently begging me with her eyes to say the word, authorize. Brittany looked like she was going to be sick. The ledger was finally open on the table. It was time to balance the account. I looked at my sister. The color had drained from her cheeks, leaving her pale and silent. I did not raise my voice or offer an apology for the reality of the situation. I looked down at the phone resting on the mahogany desk and delivered my instruction to the banker on the other end of the line. Freeze the subsidiary accounts pending my formal review. Stepping into the elevator, the polished metal doors slid shut, sealing away the spectacle I had just left behind. As the car descended toward the Chicago lobby, my pulse remained steady. I thought about the man who orchestrated this exact moment. Grandpa Richard did not build a nationwide freight and logistics empire by making careless decisions. He was a man who understood the value of a strong foundation. He spent his life observing the shifting weight of supply chains, and when his health began to fail, he turned that same analytical eye toward his own bloodline. My family treated Richard like a forgotten bank vault. They only visited when they needed a withdrawal. Tyler once asked for a startup loan while sitting in Richard's intensive care recovery room. Brittany requested a graduation trip to Europe the week Richard lost the ability to walk unassisted. Susan constantly complained about the smell of the medical equipment in the house. Richard watched all of it. He watched them circle his wealth like vultures, and he watched me build a fortress around his dignity. He realized that handing millions of dollars to people who lacked the discipline to manage a simple utility bill was a recipe for ruin. Wealth without accountability is a poison. Richard did not just leave me his fortune, he left me the ultimate authority over the cure. Over the next 3 days, my family exhibited a fascinating psychological response. Instead of calling to apologize or asking for a meeting to understand the new parameters, they retreated into a state of fierce delusion. They convinced themselves that the phone call was a theatrical bluff. In their minds, I was still just Jenna, the quiet auditor, who lacked the spine to truly challenge them. They reasoned that the local lawyer would find a loophole, or that the private bank had made a clerical error, or most likely that I would simply cave under the pressure. I was the fixer. They assumed I would fix this too. Operating under this delusion, they resumed their normal behavior. They proceeded to spend the inheritance they did not possess. Tyler was the first to act. By Wednesday afternoon, he walked into a high-end European auto dealership in the suburbs. He had been eyeing a sleek, custom-ordered sports car for months, waiting for the estate to clear. The vehicle carried a price tag of $150,000. Armed with the preliminary will reading documents and a profound sense of arrogance, he signed a short-term bridge lease. He convinced the dealership that a wire transfer was scheduled for Friday morning. He posted a photo of his hands resting on the leather steering wheel with a caption about hard work paying off. He was driving a six-figure liability, assuming his quiet sister would act as his invisible safety net. Brittany moved with equal recklessness. She had been engaged for 2 years, delaying the wedding until she could afford an event that looked impressive on social media. Believing her trust fund was days away from clearing, she scheduled an urgent meeting with a luxury bridal planner. She selected a cliffside destination venue in the Caribbean. The planner required a hefty, non-refundable deposit to secure the date. Brittany handed over a credit card she had maxed out, signing contracts that legally bound her to tens of thousands of dollars in upcoming vendor payments. She was securing floral arrangements and custom silk draping for a party she expected me to quietly finance. Susan took her entitlement directly to the source. On Thursday morning, she drove to the Oakbrook estate. She had never liked the vintage mahogany cabinets or the classic architectural details my grandfather cherished. She hired a premium contracting crew, authorizing them to begin an immediate demolition of the main floor. Sledgehammers hit the drywall before noon. She ordered imported Italian marble for a kitchen redesign, instructing the lead contractor to send the upfront materials invoice to the estate trust account. She walked through the dusty, echoing halls of my grandfather's home, acting like a queen who had finally inherited her throne, completely oblivious to the fact that the castle belonged to someone else. I observed this unfolding disaster from the quiet sanctuary of my downtown apartment. The private bank provided me with a secure digital portal, allowing me to monitor the rejected transaction requests bouncing against the frozen subsidiary accounts. I watched the dealership wire request hit the ledger and bounce back. I watched the bridal deposit trigger an insufficient funds alert. I watched the contractor invoice route to a holding file requiring my digital signature for approval. My family was building a mountain of debt, built entirely on the assumption of my submission. They believed Friday would bring a flood of liquid cash to wash away their reckless choices. They were treating the chief executive officer of their trust fund like an unpaid personal assistant, demanding the universe bend to their whims while ignoring the very person holding the pen. I closed my laptop and poured a cup of black coffee. The storm was gathering off the coast of Lake Michigan, the wind rattling the glass of my high-rise windows. Friday was approaching. The day they expected their lavish distributions. The day the reality of their situation would finally break down their doors. I set my coffee mug on the counter, put on my tailored suit, and prepared to take the elevator up to the 45th floor of the Harrison Wealth Management building. It was time to look at the physical paperwork. It was time to understand the true depth of the power Richard had handed me. I checked in at the marble security desk, trading my driver's license for a secure digital keycard. The private elevator shot up to the 45th floor so fast my ears popped. The doors parted to reveal a space defined by quiet, understated luxury. There were no teller lines and no promotional posters. The environment was composed entirely of frosted glass walls, rich mahogany wood accents, and panoramic views of Lake Michigan stretching out toward the horizon. A receptionist offered me a glass of sparkling water and guided me down a thick carpeted hallway to a corner boardroom. David Vance stood waiting near the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was a sharp-featured man in his late 50s, wearing a charcoal-tailored suit that projected quiet authority. He extended a firm handshake, treating me with a level of professional deference my mother and siblings had never once displayed. He did not look at me and see a tired caretaker or an expendable daughter. He saw the controlling shareholder of a highly lucrative enterprise. We sat opposite each other at the long walnut table. Resting on the polished wood between us was a thick leather-bound portfolio and a single unsealed manila folder. David placed his hands flat on the table and began to explain the actual architecture of my grandfather's estate. Richard Patterson was a man who built a regional shipping empire starting with a single rusted cargo van in the 1970s. He survived economic crashes and severe industry deregulation by identifying inefficiencies and cutting them out without hesitation. He despised waste. He despised unearned arrogance even more. David opened the heavy portfolio and explained that Richard did not leave behind a conventional trust fund. He did not simply place cash into accounts for his heirs to drain at their leisure. Instead, he structured his entire net worth into a primary holding corporation. The real estate, the liquid capital, the stock portfolios, and the commercial assets all belong to this central entity. I looked at the organizational chart printed on heavy stock paper. My name sat at the very top. I was not merely a beneficiary waiting for a monthly allowance. I was the legally appointed chief executive officer and sole trustee of the entire mechanism. The distributions allocated to Susan Tyler and Brittany were legally classified as conditional subsidiary payouts. They were corporate dividends, and dividends are only paid when the board of directors approves them. In this scenario, I was the entire board. I possessed the unilateral authority to manage, invest, withhold, or release every single dollar generated by the estate. David closed the leather portfolio and slid the manila folder across the polished wood. He maintained steady eye contact, stating that the portfolio contained the mathematics of the estate, but the folder contained the philosophy. I opened the flap and pulled out a stack of legal documents. The header on the first page read, Productive Behavior Clause. My eyes scanned the text, my professional instincts taking over immediately. At my auditing firm, I reconcile accounts for mid-sized healthcare providers and regional manufacturers. My job is to find the missing dollars, the phantom expenses, and the hidden liabilities. I track the flow of capital and expose the truth hiding beneath layers of corporate jargon. Reading my grandfather's trust documents utilized the exact same muscle memory. As I read the legal parameters line by line, I searched for weaknesses, looking for the vague phrasing my family would inevitably try to exploit. There were no cracks. The legal phrasing was airtight, drafted by attorneys who charged thousands of dollars an hour to ensure zero ambiguity. The clause mandated that the subsidiary beneficiaries were entitled to their allocated funds only if they demonstrated responsible, self-sufficient lifestyles. The stipulations were remarkably specific. They required maintaining gainful employment, avoiding reckless debt, and demonstrating respectful conduct toward the estate and its trustee. David leaned forward, tapping a silver pen against the mahogany table. He explained that Richard anticipated heavy resistance. My grandfather knew his children and grandchildren would attempt to circumvent my authority. Because of that reality, the document specifically barred any beneficiary from initiating legal action to force a distribution. If they attempted to sue me for access to the funds, they triggered an automatic disinheritance clause. The legal architecture was defensive, highly aggressive, and fully compliant with state law. I thought about Tyler's work history. He had launched 3 different technology startups in the past 4 years, all of which failed because he refused to wake up before noon or write a basic business plan. Richard had bailed him out every time, watching his grandson burn through capital while demanding more. I thought about Brittany, who dropped out of a prestigious university because the professors expected her to study, choosing instead to live rent-free in one of Richard's properties while complaining about the outdated kitchen appliances. I thought about Susan, who spent decades treating her own father like a walking credit card, oblivious to the exhausting reality of his failing health. Richard had tolerated it while he was alive, perhaps out of some misplaced paternal guilt. But in death, he handed the ledger to the one person who knew exactly what everything cost. I sat back in the leather chair, staring out at the Chicago skyline. I expected to feel a surge of vindictive triumph. I expected the bitter anger that had quietly pooled in my chest over the last 5 years to finally boil over. Instead, I felt nothing but a cold, steady calm. It was the exact sensation I experience when a messy, chaotic corporate ledger finally balances down to the penny. The chaos resolves into undeniable logic. I looked down at the paperwork and realized Richard had not given me a weapon. A weapon is loud and causes collateral damage. He had given me a mirror. If Tyler, Brittany, and Susan wanted to access their millions, they simply had to act like rational, accountable adults. They had to pay their own bills, work honest jobs, and treat people with basic dignity. If they chose to act like entitled parasites, the mirror would reflect that choice back at them in the form of declined transactions and empty bank accounts. Their fate was entirely in their own hands. I was just the auditor keeping score. I signed the necessary acknowledgement forms, pressing my pen firmly onto the signature lines, and slid the paperwork back to David. I thanked him for his time, shook his hand, and walked out of the boardroom. I stepped back into the private elevator, watching the numbers tick down as I descended to the street level. Friday was rapidly approaching. The day they expected their preliminary disbursements. The day the bridge leases the non-refundable deposits and the contractor invoices would crash into their frozen accounts. The trap was set and they were sprinting directly into it. Friday morning arrived with the crisp predictability of a well-maintained ledger. I sat at my desk inside the downtown accounting firm, the early sunlight reflecting off the surrounding glass skyscrapers. The office HVAC system hummed a steady, quiet rhythm. My primary monitor displayed a complex quarterly tax reconciliation for a regional medical supplier. My secondary monitor, however, was logged into the secure client portal provided by Harrison Wealth Management. I held a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee, letting the steam rise against my face, and waited for the Federal Reserve System to open its daily transaction window. Financial institutions operate on strict schedules. Wire transfers and high-volume electronic clearinghouse payments typically process in batches beginning right at 9 in the morning Eastern Standard Time. In Chicago, that meant the financial reckoning would commence precisely at 8 o'clock. I took a slow sip of my coffee and watched the digital dashboard. At 2 minutes past the hour, the first red notification illuminated my screen. It was a blocked wire transfer originating from Tyler's newly established subsidiary trust. The destination routing number belonged to the high-end European auto dealership in the suburbs. I watched the status update change from pending to rejected due to unauthorized administrative hold. I pictured my brother at that exact moment. Tyler is the kind of man who expects the universe to yield to his preferences simply because he exists. He had likely bragged to the dealership's finance manager about his newly inherited wealth, signing a short-term bridge lease on a six-figure sports car with the swagger of a self-made mogul. Bridge leases require immediate funding to finalize the title transfer. When the federal wire failed to materialize, the finance manager would not offer polite extensions. Luxury car dealers possess zero tolerance for bounced wires. They would call Tyler, their tone shifting from sycophantic to strictly transactional, demanding he return the vehicle or produce a certified cashier's check immediately. The humiliation of that phone call would hit him like a physical blow. 20 minutes later, a second red alert flashed across my private dashboard. This rejection involved a massive automated clearinghouse withdrawal attempted against Brittany's designated account. The transaction was coded for a premier destination event planning firm based in Miami. Brittany had attempted to push a $50,000 deposit to secure her cliffside Caribbean wedding venue. In the luxury event industry, vendors do not hold dates based on verbal promises. They require cleared capital. When that payment returned a fatal error code, the bridal planner would send a very different kind of email. There would be no more talk of custom silk draping or imported orchids. The correspondence would be a terse, legally mandated warning threatening immediate cancellation of the reserved date and forfeiture of any preliminary retainer. My sister, who had built her entire social media persona around projecting effortless affluence, was about to face the reality of vendor blacklists. The third notification arrived just before 9:30. It was a rapid succession of declined point-of-sale transactions tied to Susan's newly issued estate debit card. The geographic tag placed the attempts at a premium architectural hardware and supply center near the Oak Brook property. I envisioned my mother standing at the checkout counter. She had authorized a demolition crew to gut the main floor of my grandfather's home, and those crews require upfront materials fees to secure the imported marble and custom lumber, she demanded. She probably handed the sleek heavy metal estate card to the cashier with a practiced look of aristocratic boredom. The cashier would insert the chip. The terminal would beep the harsh, dissonant tone of a rejected payment. Susan would insist the machine was malfunctioning. She would instruct the cashier to tap the card, then swipe the magnetic strip, her voice rising in pitch with each consecutive failure. The line of contractors behind her would shift impatiently. The facade of the grieving wealthy matriarch would crumble right there in the checkout aisle, replaced by the stinging embarrassment of a declined card. I set my coffee mug down on a cork coaster. The banking infrastructure had executed my instructions perfectly. The financial oxygen supply was cut. Now I just had to wait for the physiological reaction. It started at 10:15. My smartphone resting face up, next to my keyboard, vibrated against the desk. The screen lit up with a notification from the family group chat. Tyler had created the thread 3 days ago, boldly naming it Patterson Estate Management. The messages rolled in like a slow-moving avalanche. Susan typed the first message asking if anyone else was experiencing banking glitches. She claimed her new card was acting temperamental, and the bank's fraud department must have placed an overly cautious hold on her account. Brittany responded seconds later, her text a frantic stream of rapid-fire panic. She said her wedding planner just sent a cancellation warning because the venue deposit bounced. She blamed the private bank, calling their customer service incompetent. Tyler chimed in, projecting his usual unfounded authority. He assured them both that the federal wire system was likely experiencing a localized outage. He claimed his dealership was being ridiculous over a minor technical delay, insisting the funds were guaranteed and the bank was just slow to process the digital paperwork. I watched the gray typing bubbles appear, disappear, and reappear. I read every word without moving my hands from my keyboard. Their psychology was fascinating. They were facing catastrophic financial rejections. Yet the concept of personal accountability never crossed their minds. They did not suspect that their access had been intentionally revoked. They did not for a single second consider that the quiet, compliant auditor who answered the speakerphone in the lawyer's office had actually wielded the power she was given. They were treating a targeted financial freeze like a passing thunderstorm, assuming it was an inconvenience orchestrated by faceless bank tellers. The vibration on my desk intensified. The group chat shifted from confusion to anger, and then predictably to demanding a rescue. A direct message from Tyler arrived on my private feed, bypassing the group thread. The text illuminated the screen, displaying his profound lack of self-awareness. "The bank is screwing up our accounts. Use your boring finance skills and call them to fix it. Mom is crying." I read the two sentences several times. The sheer audacity of the demand was a masterpiece of entitlement. He was driving a leased car he could not afford. Brittany was planning a party with phantom money. Susan was tearing down a house she did not own. They were drowning in liabilities they created, and their immediate instinct was to command the very person they mocked to serve as their administrative life raft. Tyler did not ask for my help. He demanded my labor. He weaponized our mother's tears to force my compliance, relying on a dynamic that had governed our family for 3 decades. He expected me to drop my corporate workload, spend hours on hold with the wealth management division, untangle their messy transactions, and restore their access to my grandfather's fortune. He still viewed me as the unpaid personal assistant. He still believed the speakerphone revelation was just legal jargon that did not actually alter the hierarchy of our family. I picked up the phone. I opened the message. I looked at the blinking cursor in the text field. The instinct to reply was a ghost of my former self. For years I had managed their crises. I had paid the utility bills when Tyler forgot. I had smoothed over the arguments when Brittany insulted Richard's nursing staff. I had absorbed Susan's sharp critiques while managing the logistics of her own father's hospice care. My hands knew the rhythm of appeasement. I closed the messaging application. I locked the screen. I placed the phone face down on the desk. There is a specific, rigorous discipline required to do nothing. When you have spent your entire adult life catching the fragile things, your family drops, letting the glass shatter on the floor requires an immense amount of restraint. I turned my attention back to the quarterly tax reconciliation on my primary monitor. I clicked my mouse, adjusting a column of deductible expenses for my client. I let the group chat vibrate against the wood surface of my desk. They were going to spend the rest of the day screaming at customer service representatives who possessed zero authorization to unlock their accounts. The private bankers at Harrison Wealth Management were instructed to deflect all inquiries back to the trustee. Eventually, the realization would breach their defenses. They would realize the bank was not experiencing an outage. They would understand the accounts were not flagged for standard fraud. The truth would find them and it would carry my name. The workday ended at 5 o'clock. I packed my laptop into my leather briefcase and rode the elevator down to the lobby. Stepping out onto the Chicago pavement, the evening air felt remarkably clear. I walked toward the train station, leaving the vibrating phone buried deep in my bag. I was heading home to an empty apartment. I needed to finish closing out a few of Richard's lingering utility accounts, using his old laptop. I had no idea that opening his web browser would hand me the final piece of evidence I needed to dismantle their entitlement permanently. I unlocked the deadbolt and stepped into my apartment. The environment offered immediate sanctuary from the chaotic energy vibrating through the city streets below. This space is not sprawling or opulent. It is a practical two-bedroom unit nestled in a quiet Chicago neighborhood. I purchased it 7 years ago when I first started climbing the corporate ladder. Securing the mortgage back then presented a significant challenge. Junior auditors do not command massive salaries, and the banks required a secondary guarantor. My grandfather stepped forward without hesitation. He reviewed my budget, noted my disciplined spending habits, and added his signature to the loan documents. He respected hard work. He co-signed the deed to help me build a foundation, never asking for a single dime in return. My smartphone stayed hidden inside my briefcase. The financial devastation raining down on my family was their burden to navigate. I changed into comfortable clothing, prepared a simple meal, and sat at my dining table. I needed to conclude a mundane administrative task. I retrieved Richard's bulky, outdated laptop from a storage box. He despised modern ultra-thin devices. He preferred substantial machines with heavy keyboards and large, glaring screens. I pressed the power button, listening to the cooling fan whir to life, intending to close out an obsolete municipal utility account tied to a warehouse he sold a decade ago. The operating system booted and I launched the web browser. The software automatically restored the tabs from his previous session. A webmail interface materialized on the screen. It was an iCloud portal. My grandfather possessed a brilliant calculating mind. He demanded constant visibility into the variables surrounding his empire. Years prior, Susan had configured a shared tablet for him, carelessly linking her own primary email address to the device. Richard clearly retained those login credentials. He quietly monitored her communications, observing the true nature of his errors, while his physical strength faded. The inbox displayed a lengthy chain of correspondence between my mother, my brother, and my sister. I leaned closer to the glowing screen. Susan had initiated the digital conversation. She somehow discovered Richard's name on my property deed. Because he was a co-signer, his inevitable passing meant his fractional equity would transfer into his primary estate. Susan confidently outlined her strategy to leverage her anticipated multi-million-dollar inheritance against me. She planned to initiate a legal partition sale. In Illinois, a partition lawsuit allows any co-owner of a property to force a court-ordered auction if the parties cannot agree on a buyout. Susan knew I lacked the liquid capital to fight a protracted legal battle. Her email explicitly stated her intention to hire aggressive litigation attorneys, drain my savings through endless court motions, and compel the liquidation of my home. She wanted to strip away the sanctuary I worked tirelessly to maintain. She did not merely want her own wealth. She wanted to orchestrate my financial ruin. Tyler responded to her sinister proposal with a laughing emoji. His follow-up text displayed a breathtaking level of cruelty. He joked that seeing me tossed onto the pavement would be the perfect conclusion to my boring, pathetic existence. He suggested they celebrate my eviction with a luxury dinner downtown using the estate funds. Brittany chimed in shortly after. She dismissed the severity of making her own sister homeless. Her message stated, I could simply lease a dingy, cheap apartment in some distant suburb. She typed that I possessed no meaningful social life anyway, so living in isolation would suit my personality perfectly. I read the digital correspondence a second time, letting the brutal reality of their words wash over me. The glow of the monitor cast long shadows across my dining room. The betrayal was not a crime of passion or a careless mistake. It was a predatory, calculated scheme. They were perfectly content to abandon the patriarch who funded their lavish lifestyles. They were equally eager to obliterate the one person who sacrificed her youth to keep him comfortable. They resented my competence. They despised the quiet discipline that highlighted their own profound failures. Suddenly, my grandfather's actions made perfect sense. Richard read this exact email thread. He witnessed their malicious plotting. Instead of confronting them and triggering a useless screaming match, he contacted his downtown wealth management directors. He rewrote the entire legal architecture of his legacy. He transformed their guaranteed inheritance into a conditional allowance governed entirely by the granddaughter they planned to destroy. He handed me the shield to block their attack and the sword to strike back. Any fractional ounce of familial obligation I harbored evaporated into the cold evening air. The biological connection, tethering me to those three people, dissolved completely. I was no longer a daughter seeking approval. I was no longer an older sister trying to set a responsible example. I was the gatekeeper holding the absolute keys to their survival. The heavy burden of guilt that usually accompanies setting boundaries vanished. I felt remarkably light. They had constructed a trap designed to shatter my life, completely unaware that the trap was currently snapping shut on their own limbs. I safely ejected the hard drive, powered down the bulky laptop, and stored the machine inside my filing cabinet. The apartment felt different now. It felt like a fortress they could never breach. As I locked the cabinet drawer, the silence in my home broke. My smartphone, still resting inside my leather briefcase, began to emit a rapid series of unique notification tones. It was not the standard chime for a text message or a missed call. It was a specific alert generated by a local community networking application. Since their private demands failed to produce the rescue they required, Susan was shifting her tactics. The financial panic of Friday afternoon was evolving into a desperate, vindictive weekend. She was preparing to wage a public war, unaware that I now possessed the ammunition to end it. The weekend passed in a heavy, unbroken silence on my end. I ignored every incoming call and deleted every frantic text message without reading past the preview lines. By Monday morning, the reality of their financial starvation had firmly set in. The auto dealership had undoubtedly demanded Tyler return the leased sports car, likely sending a flatbed tow truck to reclaim their asset when his wire transfer failed to materialize. The general contractor hired to remodel the Oak Brook estate had certainly packed up his heavy equipment, leaving my mother standing in a half-demolished kitchen with zero credit to finish the job. Brittany was staring down the barrel of a cancelled wedding. When private manipulation fails to produce the desired result, an entitled mind pivots seamlessly to public retaliation. They believe social pressure is an inescapable trap. They assume that if they can manufacture enough external shame, their target will surrender simply to make the embarrassment stop. A colleague at my accounting firm, a woman who lives in the western suburbs, forwarded me a web link right before my lunch break. It directed me to the Oak Brook Community Facebook page. The digital group is a localized forum typically reserved for debating property taxes, recommending landscapers, or posting about loose dogs. Dropping a highly personal family conflict into that specific arena was a calculated disruption. Susan had uploaded a 4-minute video of herself sitting on the patio of my grandfather's estate. Her presentation was a masterclass in theatrical manipulation. She had deliberately removed her expensive jewelry. She washed off her signature heavy makeup, leaving her face pale and drawn. Instead of her usual designer blouses, she wore a slightly oversized muted gray cardigan. She looked directly into the camera lens, clutching a crumpled tissue, and introduced herself to the local neighborhood as a grieving widow and a heartbroken daughter. In the video, she managed to force a single trembling tear down her cheek. She told the community that her oldest daughter had uncovered a technical legal loophole in Richard's estate planning. She never mentioned the private bank. She never mentioned the trust structure. She spun a fabricated tale framing me as a jealous, spiteful child who hijacked the family inheritance. She claimed I was holding their rightful funds hostage out of sheer bitterness, demanding they kneel to my arbitrary authority before I would release the money meant to keep a roof over her head. Below the video, the comment section was a churning sea of suburban outrage. Neighbors who had never once offered to help me bathe my grandfather or drive him to his dialysis appointments were suddenly overflowing with righteous indignation. They offered Susan Casserole's prayers and recommendations for aggressive local attorneys. They typed out paragraphs calling me a disgrace, a sociopath, and a predatory daughter exploiting a grieving family. While Susan mobilized the neighborhood, Tyler targeted our bloodline. He does not use public social media for his dirty work. He utilizes the family directory. Tyler understands the underlying dynamics of our extended relatives scattered across southern Illinois. They are traditional gossip-hungry people who have always favored the men in the family, viewing Tyler as a golden heir who simply needed the right opportunity to succeed. Tyler spent his Monday morning calling our great-aunts, second cousins, and distant uncles. He utilized a highly specific vocabulary designed to trigger their conservative sensibilities. He framed me as a dramatic, bitter spinster. He told them that because I was single and trapped in a boring corporate cubicle, I deeply resented Brittany's upcoming beautiful marriage and his own entrepreneurial brilliance. He sold them a narrative where I used legal trickery to ruin my younger sister's special day out of pure, unadulterated spite. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my smartphone was a glowing beacon of incoming hostility. A text message arrived from Aunt Patricia, a woman I had not seen in 4 years. She typed a rambling, vicious paragraph, accusing me of breaking my grandfather's heart from beyond the grave. Uncle Robert bypassed text messaging entirely. He left a staggering 3-minute voicemail on my answering service. His voice echoed with unearned authority as he called me a greedy embarrassment to the Patterson name, officially ordering me to stop abusing my mother and release the stolen funds. None of them called to ask for my perspective. None of them inquired about the actual legal structure of the trust. They swallowed the fabricated narrative whole because it perfectly fit the roles my mother assigned to us decades ago. I was the cold workaholic. They were the victims. This is the exact juncture where normal people break. When faced with a coordinated smear campaign, the average person panics. They rush into the comment sections to defend their character. They call the angry uncles back, weeping and pleading for understanding. They engage with the abusers, hoping logic or truth will somehow pierce the delusion. I did none of that. In the corporate auditing profession, investigators are trained to recognize the true value of an arrogant suspect. When you discover a fraudulent ledger, you rarely confront the embezzler immediately upon finding the first discrepancy. If you challenge them too early, they hide their tracks. They shred the documents. They delete the correspondence. Instead, you wait in the shadows. You let them continue forging signatures and moving illicit capital. The more they act, the more evidence they generate to seal their own fate. My family was willingly, eagerly supplying me with an airtight legal defense. The documents I reviewed on the 45th floor of the Harrison Wealth Management Building were crystal clear. The productive behavior clause explicitly prohibited any beneficiary from directing abusive, harassing, or defamatory conduct toward the trustee. My grandfather's legal team had anticipated this exact scenario. They knew Susan would resort to social terrorism if she lost control of the purse strings. I set my smartphone on a charging dock beside my laptop. I poured a glass of ice water, sat back down at my desk, and opened my secure encrypted drive. I created a new digital directory. I typed the title with slow, deliberate keystrokes. Exhibit a violation of productive behavior clause. I utilized a screen recording software to capture the high-definition video file of Susan's theatrical performance before she could ever think to delete it. I took scrolling time-stamped screenshots of every single neighbor and acquaintance validating her lies in the public comment section. I exported the audio files of the hostile voicemails left by my extended relatives, converting them into pristine digital records. I categorized the incoming text messages by date, sender, and level of aggression, dropping each image into the corresponding subfolder. I spent the remainder of my afternoon meticulously organizing the incoming attacks. I felt a deep, abiding sense of peace. The smear campaign was designed to isolate me, but it only served to fortify my position. My family was shouting their cruelty into the digital void, completely unaware that the quiet auditor they despised was simply recording their confessions. Their public tantrum was reaching a fever pitch, setting the stage perfectly for their next disastrous maneuver. They were about to realize that crying on the internet does not pay luxury car leases, and that desperation always leads entitled people to seek out hired guns. By Tuesday morning, the digital sympathy my mother manufactured on social media had run its natural course. Sympathy is a fleeting currency, and unfortunately for my family, it does not possess any actual purchasing power. A neighbor dropping off a baked ziti does not satisfy a luxury auto dealership demanding the return of a stolen vehicle. A chorus of internet strangers validating your victimhood does not appease a general contractor who is threatening to place a mechanic's lien on your property for unpaid construction materials. The financial reality was crushing them, and their timeline for a graceful exit had expired. When entitled individuals realize they cannot manipulate a situation through private guilt trips or public shaming, they always pivot to intimidation. They seek out a hired gun. They look for someone loud enough to frighten their target into submission. I was reviewing a corporate ledger at my desk when a secure email notification appeared on my secondary monitor. The sender was David Vance from Harrison Wealth Management. The subject line contained a single phrase indicating forwarded legal correspondence. I clicked the icon opening the encrypted portal. Tyler and Susan had pooled whatever meager resources they still possessed to hire a local estate litigator named Bradley Stone. Bradley was not a quiet, high-rise attorney who dealt in generational wealth. He was the kind of lawyer who purchased full-page advertisements on the back of regional phone directories promising to fight for the money you deserved. His practice relied on volume bluster and bullying opposing parties into swift settlements to avoid court costs. I read the attached letterhead. The prose was dripping with pompous aggression. Bradley addressed the correspondence to the Wealth Management Division, referring to me throughout the document as the so-called trustee. He formally accused me of acting in bad faith, alleging I had unlawfully hijacked his client's rightful assets out of personal spite. He threw around heavy legal terminology designed to induce panic in a layman. He claimed I was in direct violation of my fiduciary duty. He demanded an immediate in-person meeting to facilitate the unconditional surrender of the estate funds. The closing paragraph contained the ultimate threat. Bradley stated that if the bank and the acting trustee refused to comply with his demands by Thursday morning, he would file an emergency injunction in state court, freeze my professional assets, and seek punitive damages for emotional distress. I leaned back in my ergonomic office chair. A normal person receiving a formal threat of litigation feels a cold spike of adrenaline. They envision crowded courtrooms, towering legal fees, and the terrifying prospect of a judge dismantling their life. I did not feel fear. I felt a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. In my profession, threats are meaningless without documentation. I picked up my smartphone and dialed David Vance's direct line. He answered on the first ring, his tone carefully neutral. He asked if I had reviewed the forwarded correspondence from opposing counsel. I confirmed I had read every word. David cautioned me that while the underlying trust parameters were impenetrable, dealing with aggressive local litigators could become tedious. He offered to have the Harrison Wealth Management internal legal team draft a swift terminating response to shut Bradley Stone down before the week ended. I declined his offer. I instructed David to reply to the email and accept the meeting. There was a brief pause on the line. David asked for clarification, verifying that I actually wanted to sit in a room with a hostile attorney and 3 furious beneficiaries. I told him I wanted the meeting booked for Thursday morning in his largest conference room. I wanted Tyler, Susan, and Brittany present. Most importantly, I wanted Bradley Stone sitting right across the table. I instructed my banker to assure opposing counsel that the trustee would arrive ready to review the documentation. I ended the call and placed my phone back on the desk. The ambush was no longer a theoretical concept. The trap was set, and the prey had just hired a guide to lead them directly into the center of it. Tuesday evening arrived with a quiet intensity. I locked the deadbolt of my apartment, changed into comfortable clothes, and walked into my home office. The space is sparse, dominated by a large wooden desk and a high-capacity laser printer I use for complex audits. I powered on the machine, listening to the internal gears hum to life. The smell of warm toner filled the small room. I opened the encrypted external drive containing the digital evidence I had meticulously gathered over the past week. It was time to transform their digital arrogance into physical, undeniable consequences. I started with the foundation. I pulled up the digitized copy of my grandfather's trust parameters, the exact document I had reviewed on the 45th floor. I printed the specific pages detailing the productive behavior clause. I utilized a yellow highlighter drawing a bright, unmissable line across the subsection regarding legal challenges. The text clearly stated that any beneficiary initiating hostile legal action to force a distribution automatically triggered an immediate and permanent penalty phase. By hiring Bradley Stone and threatening an injunction, they had effectively handed me the legal right to cut them off forever. The lawyer they paid to save them had just signed their financial death warrant. Next, I opened the folder containing the transaction logs. I printed the crisp black and white records of their financial recklessness. The rejected wire transfer for the luxury sports car lease. The bounced clearinghouse payment for the destination wedding venue. The string of declined debit card attempts at the architectural hardware store. These pages represented the immediate consequences of their unearned entitlement. Finally, I opened the directory labeled Exhibit A. I selected the high-resolution screenshots of the iCloud email thread. The ink transferred onto the bright white paper, immortalizing their cruel jokes about forcing me onto the street. I printed the captures of Susan's theatrical social media video, alongside the time-stamped records of every vicious voicemail and text message they had weaponized against me over the weekend. I gathered the warm stacks of paper. I took 4 heavy premium manila folders from my supply drawer. I lined them up across the surface of my wooden desk. In the corporate world, an auditor never walks into a hostile reconciliation meeting empty-handed. You build a fortress out of paper. You create identical records for every person at the table, eliminating any opportunity for them to claim ignorance or deny the evidence. I built the folders with methodical precision. Into the first folder, I placed the highlighted trust parameters, the financial rejections, and the documented smear campaign. I closed the flap and wrote Bradley Stone's name across the top in sharp block letters. I repeated the exact same process for the second, third, and fourth folders, addressing them to Susan, Tyler, and Brittany. I ran my hand over the thick stack of manila envelopes. They carried a significant physical weight. This was the culmination of 5 years of silent observation, quiet endurance, and meticulous record-keeping. My family had spent decades building an illusion of superiority, relying on noise and intimidation to maintain their hierarchy. But noise dissipates the moment it leaves the mouth. Intimidation fades when it meets a stronger force. Paper does not flinch. Black ink does not forget. I slid the 4 identical folders into my leather briefcase, snapping the brass clasps shut. The satisfying metallic click echoed in the quiet room. I turned off the laser printer and switched off the office light. The preparation phase was officially complete. They believed they were walking into a negotiation on Thursday morning. They thought their hired litigator was going to pound his fists on a mahogany table and force the quiet, obedient daughter to surrender the keys to the kingdom. They had no idea they were walking into their own execution. Thursday morning brought a relentless driving rainstorm that swept across Lake Michigan and engulfed the Chicago skyline. Water lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Harrison Wealth Management building, obscuring the panoramic view of the city below. Inside the 45th floor executive suite, the climate control system maintained a perfect temperate silence. The environment smelled faintly of lemon oil and expensive espresso, a stark contrast to the chaotic weather raging outside. I arrived 40 minutes early, bypassing the main reception area, through a secure side entrance David Vance had arranged. We sat in a small private antechamber, directly adjacent to the primary boardroom. A heavy oak door separated us from the main conference table, but it remained cracked open just enough to allow sound to travel freely between the spaces. I rested my leather briefcase on my lap, my fingers tracing the cold metal of the brass clasps, and waited for my guests to arrive. They stepped off the elevator at exactly 9:55. I listened to the muffled sound of their footsteps sinking into the thick hallway carpet. The receptionist guided them into the boardroom, offering beverages they quickly declined. Through the narrow gap in the doorframe, I observed their entrance. Their posture told a comprehensive story of manufactured confidence and unchecked arrogance. Susan followed closely behind, selecting a chair near the center of the table. She had meticulously curated her outfit for maximum sympathetic impact. She wore a subdued charcoal dress and a modest pearl necklace, clutching a crumpled tissue in her left hand. She began gently dabbing at the corners of her dry eyes, rehearsing the fragile widow routine she planned to unleash the moment I walked into the room. Brittany sat next to her, constantly refreshing the screen of her smartphone. The wedding planner had likely sent another final notice regarding the bounced venue deposit, leaving my younger sister vibrating with a nervous, impatient energy she tried to mask with a bored scowl. Then the architect of their false hope entered the room. Bradley Stone did not walk, he marched. He dropped a bulging, scuffed leather briefcase onto the polished mahogany surface. The impact produced a loud, disrespectful thud that echoed unpleasantly in the refined space. Bradley possessed the loud, blustering energy of a man who spent his career bullying people in municipal traffic courts and low-level civil disputes. He was visibly out of his element on the private wealth management floor, surrounded by frosted glass and institutional wealth, but he overcompensated by turning up his volume. He began to deliver a motivational speech to his clients, his voice carrying easily through the cracked door. He assured Tyler that corporate banks always fold at the first sign of a legitimate lawsuit. He claimed institutions like Harrison Wealth Management despised litigation because it invited unwanted regulatory scrutiny. According to his deeply flawed logic, the bank would force the trustee to release the funds just to avoid a public relations headache and a lengthy court battle. He then turned his attention to me, dissecting my character for the benefit of my family. He told Susan not to worry about my resistance. He referred to me as a glorified desk clerk who lacked the stomach for genuine conflict. He stated that corporate auditors are accustomed to hiding behind spreadsheets, claiming we crumble the second a real litigator threatens our professional credentials. He promised my mother I would walk into the room, read his drafted injunction, and sign over the authorization out of pure fear. Tyler laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that vibrated against the frosted glass. He agreed with the lawyer, boasting that I was probably hiding in a bathroom stall somewhere on the lower levels, too cowardly to even show up for the confrontation. Brittany chimed in, demanding the lawyer force me to pay the late fees on her bridal deposit as a penalty for my disobedience. I sat in the antechamber, listening to them divide the spoils of a war they had already lost. I did not feel a spike of indignation. I felt a profound sense of validation. They were operating on a fundamentally broken paradigm. They believed they held the leverage because they hired a loud voice. They failed to realize that volume is a symptom of weakness, and leverage belongs exclusively to the person holding the receipts. The digital clock on the wall shifted to 10 o'clock. The hour of reconciliation had officially arrived. David Vance stood up from his leather chair. He smoothed the lapels of his suit and looked down at me. He did not ask if I was ready. He simply nodded, recognizing the cold, unyielding composure settling over my features. I unclasped my briefcase and removed the 4 identical manila folders. They felt heavy, dense with the undeniable truth of my grandfather's directives and my family's digital betrayal. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored charcoal suit. It was not a designer garment purchased on credit. It was the uniform of a professional investigator preparing to dismantle a fraudulent enterprise. David walked out of the antechamber and entered the primary boardroom. The murmuring around the mahogany table ceased instantly. "Good morning," David said, his voice projecting the icy, polite authority of a man who manages billions in capital. "I apologize for the delay. We are ready to commence the review." Bradley Stone puffed out his chest, leaning forward to rest his forearms on the table. He prepared to launch into his rehearsed opening statement, ready to demand my immediate surrender. David did not give him the opportunity to speak. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the open doorway. "The trustee has arrived," he announced. I stepped over the threshold. The atmosphere in the room shifted with the sudden pressure drop of a collapsing vacuum. The confident smirks vanished. Tyler froze his hand, hovering rigidly over his smartphone. Brittany shrank back into the leather upholstery of her chair, her nervous energy evaporating into genuine apprehension. Susan's tissue remained suspended near her cheek, her rehearsed performance stalling out the moment she made eye contact with me. I did not offer a polite greeting. I did not apologize for the weather or engage in the customary small talk expected at family gatherings. I walked past the row of empty guest chairs lining the side of the room. I moved with deliberate, measured steps, feeling the weight of their stares tracking my progression across the thick carpet. I bypassed the side seating entirely. I walked directly to the head of the long walnut table, the seat of absolute authority, the exact position my grandfather occupied whenever he convened a board meeting to decide the fate of his logistics empire. I stood behind the high-backed leather chair. I did not sit down. I placed the stack of 4 manila folders onto the polished wood directly in front of me. The heavy paper landed with a dull, substantial thud, echoing the sound of the lawyer's briefcase, but carrying a significantly different kind of threat. I reached into my jacket pocket and retrieved a heavy steel pen. I held it in my right hand, looking down the length of the table. Bradley Stone was staring at me, his bluster temporarily derailed by the sheer, unapologetic confidence of my entrance. He had expected a trembling, apologetic daughter desperate to resolve a family dispute. He found a corporate executioner ready to present the final audit. I pressed my thumb against the top of the pen. A single sharp click fractured the silence. I looked directly at my mother, then my sister, then my brother, and finally settled my gaze on the hired litigator. The storm raged against the windows outside, but inside the boardroom the real reckoning was about to begin. The sharp click of the steel pen echoed against the frosted glass walls. Bradley Stone cleared his throat, breaking the momentary spell. He inflated his chest, leaning forward to claim control of the narrative. He was accustomed to dominating conference rooms by taking up physical space and projecting his voice. I watched his jaw tense as he prepared to deliver the aggressive opening statement he had likely rehearsed in the elevator. He intended to cite state statutes, invoke my fiduciary duty, and demand the immediate release of the frozen capital. He never got the chance to speak a single word. I picked up the top manila folder from the stack resting in front of me. I placed my palm flat against the heavy paper and pushed it forward. The envelope slid smoothly across the polished mahogany surface, stopping precisely inches from his folded hands. "Counselor," I said, keeping my vocal tone level and devoid of any emotional fluctuation, "I suggest you read the actual trust parameters before you bill your clients for a lawsuit they cannot win." Bradley blinked, startled by the clinical precision of the interruption. He looked at the folder, then back up at me, a condescending smirk beginning to form on his lips. He was used to dealing with panicked heirs trying to hide assets, not someone handing over their own financial documentation willingly. He reached out and flipped open the cardboard cover, fully expecting to find a desperate settlement offer or a flawed legal defense he could easily dismantle. While his eyes dropped to the first page, I distributed the remaining 3 envelopes. I walked around the edge of the long table, handing one to Susan, placing another in front of Tyler, and setting the final folder next to Brittany. Susan stared at the envelope as if it contained a venomous snake. Tyler snatched his off the wood, tearing the flap open with reckless, impatient energy. Brittany looked at her brother, then down at the paper, unsure of what she was supposed to do. I returned to my position at the head of the table. I instructed them to open the documents and turn directly to page 4. Tyler flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing as he encountered the dense legal terminology. Susan slowly opened her folder, her hands trembling slightly, the performative widow routine, forgotten in the face of rigid formal documentation. I addressed the room, directing my words to the hired litigator while maintaining eye contact with my family. My grandfather left me with unchallengeable discretion over all subsidiary distributions, I explained, pacing my sentences, so every syllable landed with maximum weight. The inheritances you believe you own are legally classified as conditional dividends. They are entirely contingent on a specific directive titled the Productive Behavior Clause. I watched Bradley Stone drag his index finger down the highlighted section on page 4. The condescending smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden stark gravity. To practice law effectively, an attorney relies on the accuracy of the information provided by their clients. Tyler and Susan had undoubtedly walked into his office and spun a fabricated tale. They likely told him that I was a rogue beneficiary who exploited a technical error to steal their money. They presented a scenario where a simple threatening letter would terrify me into returning their stolen property. They promised him an easy victory and a lucrative payout from their newly acquired millions. Bradley was currently reading a document drafted by one of the most ruthless, expensive corporate legal teams in the state of Illinois. The terminology was an ironclad fortress. He read the stipulations requiring gainful employment. He read the parameters prohibiting reckless debt. Then his eyes locked onto the penalty phase instructions. The text stated clearly that the trustee possessed the unilateral authority to reduce any subsidiary distribution to zero if the beneficiaries engaged in entitled, hostile, or financially destructive behavior. Most importantly, he read the specific subsection regarding external legal challenges. He realized that by sending an aggressive letter threatening an emergency injunction, he had inadvertently triggered the exact clause designed to disinherit his own clients. The color physically drained from the lawyer's neck and face. The florid, blustering energy he carried into the room evaporated. He flipped to the final page to verify the signatures, checking the notary stamps and the dates. He recognized the name of the senior partner who drafted the trust. He knew immediately that the architecture of this estate was bulletproof. Any judge in the county would look at these parameters and throw a lawsuit out of court before the ink dried on the filing. He looked up from the folder and stared at Tyler. The lawyer's expression shifted from professional confidence to deep, simmering resentment. He realized his clients had lied to him about their leverage. They possessed zero legal standing. Tyler felt the shift in the room. He looked at Bradley, waiting for the litigator to pound his fist on the table and object. He expected his hired gun to declare the paperwork invalid. Bradley did nothing. He slowly closed his folder, folded his hands over the cardboard cover, and remained seated in profound silence. The realization hit Tyler like a physical shockwave. He looked down at the highlighted text, lacking the legal literacy to understand every nuance, but possessing enough survival instinct to recognize defeat. He looked at Susan. My mother was gripping the edges of page 4, her eyes scanning the words, productive behavior, over and over again. The reality of the situation was finally penetrating her calculated delusions. They were not dealing with a delayed wire transfer. They were not victims of a banking error. The private institution had not frozen their accounts. I had frozen them. I was not the quiet, expendable daughter anymore. I was the legally fortified chief executive officer of their financial existence. I held the keys to the kingdom, and I possessed the undisputed right to lock them outside the gates permanently. Susan looked up at me, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. She tried to locate the compliant auditor she had pushed around for decades, but she found a stranger standing at the head of the table. The dynamic she had spent a lifetime enforcing was shattered beyond repair. She had raised her children to believe they were superior, yet here they sat seeking permission to survive from the very person they mocked. Brittany finally spoke, her voice a high-pitched whisper. She asked what the productive behavior clause actually meant for her wedding deposit. I did not answer her. I kept my gaze fixed on Tyler. Tyler represents the pinnacle of unearned entitlement. Men like him do not surrender gracefully when confronted with their own inadequacy. When their leverage evaporates, they substitute logic with rage. They attack the character of the person holding the mirror, desperate to break the reflection. I watched his jaw clench. The initial shock was fading rapidly, converting into a volatile defensive anger. He could not accept that his luxury car lease, his elevated social status, and his future comfort were subject to my approval. In his mind, I was still just Jenna. I was the boring sister who lived in a modest condo and spent her weekends organizing medical bills. He could not fathom a reality where I held the authority to evaluate his worth. His face flushed a deep, mottled red. He gripped the edges of the manila folder, his knuckles turning white as he crumpled the heavy paper. The silence in the boardroom stretched to its absolute breaking point, heavy with the electric tension of a looming detonation. He was preparing to launch a verbal assault intending to tear down my qualifications and declare me unfit to judge his lifestyle. I was about to cross the final boundary, completely unaware that the second tab in his folder contained the exact ammunition I needed to execute the final phase of the audit. The silence in the boardroom shattered. Tyler brought his open palm down against the polished mahogany. The impact produced a sharp, stinging crack that reverberated against the frosted glass walls. He pushed himself halfway out of his leather chair, leaning over the table with his shoulders tense and his jaw set in a rigid line. The initial shock of reading the trust parameters had mutated into a volatile defensive fury. He could not process a reality where his younger sister held the keys to his lifestyle. "You can't do this," Tyler yelled, his voice cracking with unchecked emotion. He pointed a trembling finger toward my side of the table. "You're just a pathetic auditor, you have no right to judge us." His words hung in the sterile air of the executive suite. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match his volume, nor did I offer a defensive rebuttal regarding my professional credentials. In my line of work, when a subject resorts to personal insults, it means they have run out of factual arguments. They attack your character because they cannot attack the data. Tyler and Susan reluctantly mirrored the action. Brittany turned the page with shaking fingers. Laying before them was a pristine, high-definition printed record of their own digital hubris. The top document featured the iCloud email thread they had exchanged exactly 3 weeks prior to my grandfather's passing. I had captured the screen with perfect clarity, preserving the exact timestamps the sender addresses and the specific text bubbles. Tyler stared at his own words printed in dark toner. He read the sentence where he laughed about forcing me out of my home. He saw the laughing emoji he appended to the suggestion of throwing me onto the street. Brittany looked down at her own callous contribution, reading her exact phrasing about how I could simply rent a cheap place in the suburbs because I had no life anyway. Beneath those emails lay the detailed correspondence outlining Susan's premeditated legal strategy. The paper displayed her explicit plan to utilize her anticipated inheritance to fund a partition lawsuit against my condo. It chronicled her intention to drain my savings through endless court motions and force a judicial auction of my only sanctuary. I allowed them a few moments to absorb the visual shock. Seeing your own cruelty trapped on physical paper presented in a corporate boardroom strips away the protective layer of deniability. They could not claim I misunderstood their tone. They could not argue the context was a joke. The intent was preserved in black and white. Under Section 3, Subsection B of the Primary Trust Parameters, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy atmosphere. I recited the text from memory, letting the legal phrasing dictate the rhythm of the room. Any malicious action directed against the trustee immediately disqualifies the offending beneficiary from discretionary distributions. Susan gasped, a short, sharp intake of air. She turned the page, discovering the second layer of evidence. She found the scrolling screenshots of her theatrical Facebook video. She saw the time-stamped records of her neighbors posting defamatory comments based on her fabricated narrative. Beneath the social media posts were the transcribed voicemails and text messages from our extended relatives. Every single piece of slander she orchestrated over the weekend was meticulously catalogued. She had spent the last 48 hours launching a coordinated public attack against my character, unaware that she was handing me the exact criteria required to terminate her financial future. I looked at Bradley Stone. The local litigator possessed enough legal acumen to recognize a fatal self-inflicted wound. He had walked into this building prepared to argue that I was withholding funds out of arbitrary spite. He intended to file an injunction based on a breach of fiduciary duty. Instead, he was staring at irrefutable proof that his clients had actively conspired to render the trustee homeless, followed by a documented public smear campaign designed to cause reputational damage. In the eyes of a probate judge, my decision to freeze their accounts would no longer appear vindictive. It would look like a measured, legally mandated response to a coordinated threat. The trust required me to protect the assets from hostile actors, and my family had just proven themselves to be the ultimate hostile threat. Bradley Stone reached out and closed his manila folder. He did not speak. He did not offer a counter-argument. He simply pushed the envelope away from him, placed his hands on the brass locks of his battered leather briefcase, and snapped them shut. The sharp click signaled his official resignation from the conflict. He was mentally calculating his exit strategy, realizing he would never see a dime of the contingency fee he had been promised. He was checking out, abandoning a sinking ship he had been tricked into boarding. Tyler watched his hired gun surrender. The volatile anger that had fueled his outburst just moments ago vanished, replaced by a hollow, sickening realization. The loud attorney he hired to terrify me had folded without issuing a single legal objection. Tyler sank back into his leather chair, the designer suit suddenly looking like a ridiculous costume on a defeated man. Susan dropped her crumpled tissue onto the table. The performative widow routine evaporated in an instant. The fake tears dried up and her facial features slackened into an expression of genuine, suffocating panic. The safe net she had taken for granted, her entire adult life, was gone. The Oak Brook estate she planned to remodel was legally tethered to my signature. The contractors demanding their materials fee would start calling her personal cell phone by the end of the day. She had spent her entire existence manipulating the people around her, assuming her social status shielded her from consequence. Now she was trapped in a glass room, staring across a mahogany table at the daughter she tried to destroy, realizing that daughter held the power to reduce her lifestyle to ashes. The silence that followed was fundamentally different from the quiet that preceded the meeting. It was not the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of total, inescapable defeat. They had handed me the bulletproof grounds to cut them off forever, and they knew it. The power dynamic had inverted so severely that they could not even formulate a plea for mercy. I kept my pen resting on the table. The audit was complete, the ledger was balanced, the evidence of their betrayal was entered into the official record. I possessed the legal right to stand up, walk out of the boardroom, and leave them with zero access to the wealth they worshipped. They waited in suspended animation, their futures balancing on the edge of a knife, desperate to know what their sentence would be. I remained seated at the head of the walnut table. My hands were folded neatly over the closed cover of my manila folder. I did not shift in my chair or adjust my posture. The storm continued to batter the reinforced glass of the Chicago high-rise, but inside the boardroom, the atmosphere felt entirely devoid of oxygen. Tyler was staring blankly at the printed emails, his previous outbursts suffocated by the heavy weight of his own documented cruelty. Brittany looked pale and fragile, her breathing shallow. Susan sat frozen in a state of paralyzing shock. They expected the corporate executioner to drop the final axe. They waited for me to formally announce their total disinheritance. They braced themselves for a future where they possessed nothing. I looked at the three of them, letting the silence stretch until it became physically uncomfortable. "I am not cutting you off entirely," I said. The reaction was instantaneous. A visible collective wave of relief washed over their faces. Tyler let out a long, ragged exhale, his shoulders dropping 2 inches as the tension left his spine. Susan closed her eyes, murmuring a quiet sigh of gratitude. Brittany wiped a stray tear from her cheek. They heard my sentence and immediately translated it through their flawed filter of entitlement. They assumed I lacked the fortitude to follow through with the punishment. They believed my inherent weakness had prevailed, and their precious lifestyles were safe. I allowed them to enjoy the soothing illusion of victory for exactly 3 seconds before I snatched it away. Instead, I continued, my voice dropping to a cool, unyielding register. "I am placing all of you on the productive behavior allowance." The relief drained from their expressions, replaced by fresh confusion. I did not wait for them to ask questions. I began to outline the brutal, inescapable reality of their new financial existence. "Tyler," I said, directing my focus to my older brother. His head snapped up. "The federal wire intended for your luxury car lease is permanently revoked. Harrison Wealth Management has already informed the dealership that the transaction is void due to lack of authorized funding. The dealership will expect you to return the vehicle today. If you fail to comply, they will initiate a repossession order." His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The designer suit he wore suddenly looked like a heavy burden. He was picturing the humiliation of handing the keys back to the finance manager, stripped of his fabricated prestige. Moving forward, you will receive $2,000 on the first of every month, I stated, breaking down the mathematics of his new life. That figure is not a base salary, it is a conditional stipend. To trigger the deposit, you will upload verifiable W-2 pay stubs to a secure banking portal demonstrating 40 hours of continuous weekly employment. You will secure a legitimate job. You will clock in and you will work. If you quit, if you are terminated, or if you attempt to launch another unfunded vanity startup, the monthly stipend drops to zero. I turned my attention to the right side of the table. Brittany, I said gently, though the gentleness carried the sharp edge of a scalpel. She flinched, shrinking back against the leather upholstery. The $50,000 retainer for your Caribbean venue is denied, I told her. The $50,000 retainer for your Caribbean venue is denied, I told her. The destination event is cancelled. I have authorized a maximum budget of exactly $10,000 for your nuptials. You may utilize those funds to secure a local park, a modest restaurant, or a backyard gathering. You will not receive a blank check. You will submit itemized vendor invoices to the trust portal, and the bank will pay those specific vendors directly. If you attempt to secure hidden lines of credit or manipulate the vendor contracts, your wedding allowance will be eradicated. A single genuine tear rolled down her cheek. She was visualizing the phone calls she would have to make to her affluent bridesmaids. She would have to explain why the luxury island retreat was suddenly downgraded to a local municipal venue. The social currency she valued above all else was officially bankrupt. Finally, I locked eyes with my mother. Locked eyes. Susan had spent her entire adult life avoiding accountability, utilizing my grandfather's wealth to insulate herself from the consequences of her choices. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles white, dreading the parameters of her specific sentence. The demolition at the Oakbrook estate is permanently halted, I announced. The demolition at the Oakbrook estate is permanently halted, I announced. The contractors will receive a final cashier's check this afternoon, compensating them for the physical labor they have already completed. They will not lay another tile or purchase another piece of imported marble. You will live in the house exactly as it stands right now, exposed drywall and all. Susan gasped, visualizing the dusty, unfinished kitchen she had arrogantly ordered destroyed just days prior. Your monthly estate card is deactivated. I continued, closing the final loop of her financial cage. You will be issued a restricted debit account. The trust will load a strict stipend calculated to cover municipal utilities, property taxes, and basic groceries. There is no clothing budget. There is no country club allowance. There is no discretionary slush fund. I paused, ensuring the full gravity of their new reality settled over the room. I was transforming my family into corporate employees, and I was establishing myself as the strict, uncompromising human resources department. These rules are not open for negotiation, I said, my tone echoing the sterile finality of a signed contract. Furthermore, the behavioral conditions remain in active effect. Every 30 days, each of you will submit your expense reports to the portal. If any of you complain publicly on social media, the stipend drops to zero. If you harass me via text message or voicemail, the stipend drops to zero. If you fail to submit your monthly receipts, the bank will freeze the accounts without warning. I looked down the length of the table. You will earn your survival, and you will do it quietly. Susan turned her head in a frantic, desperate motion. She looked at Bradley Stone, the hired litigator, sitting silently at the edge of the confrontation. Her eyes pleaded with him to intervene. She wanted him to pound his fist on the table, cite a hidden legal loophole, and rescue her from this suffocating corporate prison. She silently begged him to earn his retainer. Bradley did not rise to the occasion. He slowly met my mother's gaze, his expression devoid. Bradley did not rise to the occasion. He slowly met my mother's gaze, his expression devoid of any professional confidence. He gave a single somber nod, subtly gesturing toward the highlighted legal documents resting in front of her. The message was clear. There was no loophole. The trust was an ironclad fortress, and they had willingly handed the trustee the ammunition to lock the doors. The quiet daughter they had mocked for 5 years had successfully engineered a flawless audit. I had tracked their entitlement, documented their betrayal, and applied the exact corresponding penalties. I did not need to scream or cry to assert my dominance. I simply rewrote the rules of their existence. I placed them on a permanent, inescapable financial leash, and I handed the other end of that leash to a banking institution that possessed zero emotional attachment to their struggles. They sat in the quiet boardroom surrounded by frosted glass and sweeping views of a city they could no longer afford to conquer. The storm outside seemed mild compared to the structural collapse they were experiencing internally. The meeting was effectively over, but the true burden of their new reality was just beginning. They still had to stand up, walk out of the luxury high-rise, and face the immediate practical fallout waiting for them on the ground floor. The quiet inside the executive boardroom possessed a physical density. It pressed against the walls, heavy and suffocating, contrasting sharply with the relentless rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. I watched the information process through Tyler's mind. His brain fought a desperate battle against the rigid logic I had just outlined. The realization that his luxury lifestyle was reduced to a conditional blue-collar stipend ignited a visceral reaction. His face flushed a deep crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched collar. He drew in a sharp, ragged breath, planting his hands flat on the mahogany table to push himself upward. He opened his mouth, preparing to unleash a torrent of verbal abuse. He intended to scream, to hurl insults, to tear down my authority, using the same degrading tactics he had employed since childhood. Before a single syllable could escape his lips, Bradley Stone moved. The hired litigator reached across the space between their chairs and clamped a thick hand firmly onto Tyler's forearm. The grip was tight enough to wrinkle the expensive fabric of the designer suit. Bradley leaned in his face inches from my brother's ear. He did not shout. He delivered a harsh, urgent whisper that carried easily across the polished wood. "If you insult her right now, you lose the $2,000. Shut your mouth and sit down." Tyler froze. The command short-circuited his rage. For his entire life, Tyler had never been forced to swallow his pride. He always yelled until the opposition surrendered. But the attorney he paid to defend him was now acting as his warden, enforcing the very rules I had just established. Tyler looked at Bradley, then slowly turned his gaze back to me. His jaw clamped shut. He sank back into the leather upholstery, his chest heaving with suppressed fury. The submission was a jagged, bitter pill, but he swallowed it. The power dynamic in the room permanently inverted in that exact moment. He chose survival over pride, confirming that the financial leash was already functioning perfectly. To my right, a rhythmic, shallow, gasping sound broke the stillness. Brittany was clutching her chest, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the fabric of her blouse. She was beginning to hyperventilate. The air seemed to catch in her throat as her eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for an escape hatch that did not exist. I observed her panic with clinical detachment. Brittany had spent the last 2 years carefully constructing an illusion for her fiancé. He belonged to a family steeped in old established wealth, the kind of people who judge character based on zip codes and country club memberships. She had promised him a breathtaking destination wedding, assuring his snobbish parents that her family estate would easily cover the exorbitant costs. The reality of her new constraints was crashing down on her carefully curated aesthetic. She was mapping out the inevitable phone calls she would have to make before the sun went down. She would have to dial his number and explain that the Cliffside Caribbean venue was canceled due to insufficient funds. She would have to confess that her bridal budget was slashed to $10,000, an amount his family routinely spent on floral arrangements alone. She would have to suggest a local municipal park or a modest restaurant for their reception. The social embarrassment was a terminal diagnosis for her relationship. Her hyperventilation intensified as she realized she could no longer buy her way into a higher social tier. Her designer facade was crumbling, exposing the hollow foundation underneath. While Brittany struggled to breathe and Tyler seethed in silence, I met my mother's gaze. Susan had stopped looking at the highlighted trust documents. She was staring directly at me, her eyes tracking every micro-expression on my face. The theatrical grieving widow persona was entirely gone. The mask had slipped, revealing the cold, calculating survivor operating beneath the surface. For 3 decades, she had viewed me through a lens of profound underestimation. I was the dependable doormat. I was the quiet daughter she could summon to organize a closet, mediate a dispute, or manage a dying man's hospice care. She had operated on the assumption that my reliability was a symptom of weakness, believing I served the family because I lacked the spine to demand anything better. Sitting across the mahogany table, that delusion finally shattered. Susan looked at the printed screenshots of her own digital treachery. She looked at the ironclad legal parameters trapping her in a half-demolished house on a strict utility stipend. She saw the flawless execution of a trap she had confidently walked into. The realization shifted her features. The patronizing pity she usually reserved for me vanished. In its place, I saw genuine apprehension. She finally recognized me not as her obedient servant, but as a terrifyingly competent adversary. She realized that the daughter she spent years mocking was the architect of her permanent ruin. People who orchestrate hostile takeovers in the corporate sector often make a critical mistake at the finish line. They linger. They stay in the room to demand apologies, waiting to hear the defeated party admit they were wrong. They crave the emotional validation of a tearful confession. I am an auditor. I deal in spreadsheets and signed contracts, not emotional catharsis. Apologies are subjective, easily faked, and ultimately worthless on a balance sheet. I did not require their remorse. The signed documentation governing their future was all the validation I needed. I stood up from the high-backed leather chair. I picked up my steel pen, sliding it into the interior pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I buttoned the front clasp with slow, deliberate precision. I did not offer a parting lecture. I did not dispense any unsolicited advice about humility or the value of hard work. The paperwork resting in front of them contained all the instructions they would ever need to survive. I turned my attention to the private banker standing silently near the doorway. "We are finished here," I told David Vance. He offered a crisp, professional nod. He stepped to the side, opening the heavy oak door wider to facilitate my exit. I picked up my leather briefcase. I turned my back on my mother, my brother, my sister, and their hired litigator. I walked out of the boardroom without casting a single glance over my shoulder. The sound of my heels striking the thick carpet provided a steady rhythmic cadence as I moved down the frosted glass hallway. I did not rush. I walked with the measured pace of a professional who had just successfully concluded a complex negotiation. As the boardroom door clicked shut behind me, severing the visual connection to my family, I pictured the scene I was leaving behind. They were trapped in a cage of their own making. They were sitting in an opulent corporate suite they could not afford, surrounded by sweeping views of a skyline they no longer owned. The dynamic in that room would be suffocating. Tyler would eventually find his voice demanding the lawyer discover a hidden loophole. Brittany would dissolve into hysterical tears, begging her mother to fix a problem that was fundamentally unfixable. Susan would sit in paralyzed silence, grappling with the loss of her kingdom. And Bradley Stone, the man they hired to save them, would become their reluctant warden. He would have to spend the next hour walking them through the agonizing reality of their defeat. He would explain that filing a lawsuit would immediately trigger the penalty phase, terminating their meager stipends forever. He would force them to accept the blue-collar conditions of their new existence, billing them for the miserable conversation they were about to endure. They had paid an attorney to lock their own prison cell and hand me the key. I reached the security desk, trading my visitor badge for my driver's license. The receptionist offered a polite smile, unaware of the financial slaughter that had just occurred on the upper floors. I stepped into the private elevator, watching the digital floor indicator rapidly descend toward the lobby. The tension that had lived in my shoulders for 5 long years was entirely gone. I felt remarkably light. The burden of managing their chaotic, destructive lives was no longer my responsibility. They were categorized, audited, and filed away into neat, manageable digital folders. The elevator doors parted, welcoming me back into the bustling energy of the Chicago financial district. I stepped out onto the damp pavement. The storm was beginning to break, the heavy rain tapering off into a light, misty drizzle. I adjusted my grip on my briefcase and began the short walk toward my office. The immediate confrontation was over, but the practical fallout of my decisions was about to ripple through the city. They were going to try and test the boundaries of their new enclosure, searching for weaknesses in the perimeter. They would soon discover that my ledger contained zero margin for error. The immediate days following the boardroom meeting unfolded exactly as a mathematical equation resolves. Variables snap into their proper places, regardless of how the numbers feel about the calculation. For my mother, brother, and sister, the variables were crushing debt and bruised egos. The consequences of their unearned arrogance hit them with the force of a derailed freight train. Tyler faced his reckoning the very next morning. The luxury European auto dealership did not accept his blustering excuses or his promises of future wealth. In the affluent suburbs of Chicago, finance managers interact with legitimate millionaires on a daily basis. They easily recognize the distinct odor of a bounced wire transfer. The dealership dispatched a flatbed tow truck to Tyler's apartment complex, reclaiming the six-figure sports car in broad daylight while his neighbors watched. Stripped of his fabricated prestige, my brother was forced to confront his grim reality. I monitored the financial portal and watched a modest auto loan originate from a secondary high-risk lender a few days later. He purchased a 4-year-old domestic sedan with cloth seats and fading paint. He scrubbed his social media profiles, erasing the photographs featuring the leather steering wheel and the arrogant captions about his entrepreneurial success. The transition from a purported mogul to a standard commuter was swift and merciless, to satisfy the strict parameters of the productive behavior clause. Tyler had to secure immediate employment. He could no longer chase vanity startup dreams. He accepted an entry-level logistics position at a regional distribution center. The irony was profound. Our grandfather had built a shipping empire, and Tyler was now forced to walk a warehouse floor, scanning barcodes and loading pallets just to generate the W-2 pay stubs required to unlock his $2,000 monthly allowance. He clocked in at dawn wearing steel-toed boots instead of designer suits, learning the grueling value of a dollar he actually earned. Susan navigated her defeat with a different brand of desperation. She is a woman who curates her reality based entirely on neighborhood optics. Acknowledging her financial subjugation to her local social circle was an impossible concept. Instead, she spun a fresh, elaborate narrative to protect her fragile ego. The tearful Facebook video, accusing me of hijacking the inheritance, vanished from the community group, quietly deleted in the middle of the night. In its place, she uploaded a serene photograph of the Oak Brook estate garden. She typed a lengthy poetic paragraph explaining that upon deep reflection, she decided to halt the lavish renovations. She claimed the extravagant upgrades felt disrespectful to my grandfather's memory, stating she wanted to live humbly to honor his frugal spirit. The physical reality inside the house told a starkly different story. The general contractors packed their heavy equipment and departed the moment their final cashier's check cleared. They left the main floor in a state of suspended demolition. Susan lived among exposed wooden studs dangling electrical wires and bare concrete subfloors. Fine white drywall dust tracked onto her expensive Persian rugs. Cold drafts blew through the kitchen where the insulation remained unfinished. Her restricted debit account forced a radical shift in her daily routine. The trust provided a stipend calculated strictly for municipal utilities, property taxes, and basic sustenance. She could no longer patronize the artisanal boutiques and high-end organic grocers she favored. She shopped at standard supermarkets, holding a calculator in the aisle to ensure her cart did not exceed her limits. She maintained her aristocratic facade for the neighbors smiling over the garden fence while privately submitting her grocery receipts to my digital portal like a subordinate employee filing an expense report. Brittany experienced a quiet, devastating social collapse. The luxury Caribbean wedding venue canceled her reservation, releasing the date to a couple whose funds actually cleared. She was forced to call her affluent fiancé and explain the dramatic downgrade in her financial status. The revelation that she was not an heiress with a bottomless trust fund fractured the foundation of their relationship. His family, steeped in generational wealth and country club elitism, suddenly viewed her with deep suspicion. She traded her custom silk draping and imported orchids for a $10,000 catering budget at a modest municipal banquet hall. Her social currency evaporated, leaving her tethered to a reality she despised. The most satisfying shift, however, occurred within the extended family. The vast network of aunts, uncles, and distant cousins, who had eagerly bombarded my phone with vicious voicemails, suddenly experienced a profound awakening. Tyler facilitated this revelation. During a humid weekend barbecue hosted by a second cousin down in southern Illinois, Tyler consumed too many cheap beers. The alcohol eroded his fragile restraint. When an uncle casually asked why he was driving a dented sedan instead of managing his new trust fund, Tyler launched into a bitter, slurred tirade. He accidentally laid the truth bare. He shouted that the trust was a corporate prison and that I was the ruthless warden holding the keys to every single dollar. The gossip traveled through our bloodline faster than a fiber optic signal. The relatives who branded me a bitter, jealous spinster suddenly understood the actual hierarchy. They realized the quiet niece they insulted possessed undisputed control over the Patterson fortune. The realization triggered a frantic, transparent wave of backtracking. My voicemail inbox, previously filled with demands and insults, sat empty. The aggression vanished, replaced by calculated silence. Then the salvage operations began. My smartphone rang on a Tuesday evening. The caller ID displayed Aunt Patricia, the same woman who had texted a sprawling paragraph accusing me of breaking my grandfather's heart. I accepted the call, keeping the device pressed to my ear, listening to her nervous, shallow breathing. Patricia launched into a frantic apology. She claimed she had received bad information from Susan. She spun a desperate tale about how my mother manipulated her emotions, insisting she always knew I was a smart, capable woman handling a difficult situation. She laughed awkwardly, suggesting we meet for an expensive dinner downtown to catch up and heal the family rift. She was probing the perimeter, testing the defenses to see if my newfound authority could somehow benefit her own circumstances. I let her finish her rehearsed speech. I did not raise my voice, nor did I offer a reciprocal apology for the misunderstanding. I spoke with the exact clinical detachment I utilize when closing a fraudulent corporate ledger. "This account is closed," I said. I ended the call. I utilized the block feature on my smartphone, silencing her number forever. I repeated this exact process for Uncle Robert and the remaining cousins who attempted to send sweet texts or emails. They had revealed their true character when they believed I was powerless. I possessed zero interest in their fabricated loyalty now that I held the checkbook. Understanding an abusive relative does not obligate you to finance their redemption. The boundaries I established in the boardroom solidified into an impenetrable fortress. I refused to engage in the chaotic emotional theater that defined my family for decades. I stripped away the screaming matches, the guilt trips, and the passive-aggressive text messages. I channeled their entire existence into a strict bureaucratic system. Communication was restricted to the first day of the month. They were required to upload their documentation to the secure banking interface. I logged in from my home office, staring at a sterile white screen with black text. I reviewed Tyler's PDF pay stubs, verifying his continuous labor. I audited Brittany's modest vendor receipts, ensuring no hidden lines of credit existed. I checked Susan's grocery expenditures against her utility bills. If the paperwork matched the strict parameters of the productive behavior clause, I clicked a green button on the screen, applying my digital signature to the release forms. The private bank dispatched their stipends. There were no phone calls. There were no holiday gatherings. There were no negotiations. I transformed my mother, brother, and sister from a daily source of psychological torment into a sterile, easily managed accounts payable spreadsheet. The emotional burden I carried for 5 years dissipated entirely, replaced by the satisfying, predictable rhythm of a flawless audit. They survived strictly within the narrow margins I drew for them. The trap they built to destroy my sanctuary had become their permanent residence, and they were finally learning to navigate the quiet halls of accountability. The city outside my window continued to turn oblivious to the quiet justice enacted within its borders, leading directly into a final resolution that would cement my peace forever. 6 months later, I sat on the private balcony of my downtown Chicago condo, wrapping both hands around a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. The autumn wind swept off Lake Michigan, carrying the sharp, crisp chill that signals the changing of the seasons. Dawn was just beginning to break, casting a brilliant wash of gold and copper light across the glass facades of the surrounding skyscrapers. I looked down at the streets below. The city was waking up, yellow taxicabs weaving through the early morning traffic, pedestrians hurrying toward transit stations. My home, the very sanctuary my mother and brother had plotted to auction off to the highest bidder, felt remarkably secure. There were no looming partition lawsuits. There were no predatory relatives measuring my square footage. The deed resided safely in a fireproof lockbox carrying only my name. My professional life had mirrored the stability of my personal environment. Once I stopped exhausting my mental bandwidth, managing the manufactured crises of my relatives, my career trajectory accelerated rapidly. 2 months ago, my auditing firm assigned me to a highly complex reconciliation for a regional manufacturing conglomerate. The executives at that company had attempted to obscure significant liabilities within a web of offshore shell accounts. They assumed the local auditors would rubber stamp the paperwork and collect their fees. They underestimated my capacity for finding hidden truths. I spent 3 weeks mapping their transaction histories, cross-referencing obscure tax codes and tracing the hidden flow of capital. I compiled my findings into a dense, irrefutable dossier and presented it to the firm's senior partners. The following morning, the managing director called me into his office. He did not ask me to fetch coffee or organize a filing cabinet. He offered me a promotion to senior compliance director, accompanied by a corner office and a substantial equity stake in the firm. I was finally dedicating my intellect to an institution that compensated me for my competence, rather than a family that demanded my labor as an unpaid expected tribute. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, my smartphone vibrated against the wrought iron patio table. It was the first day of the month. I set my coffee mug down and picked up the device. The screen illuminated, displaying a series of automated notifications generated by the secure portal at Harrison Wealth Management. The digital infrastructure my grandfather financed was operating with flawless mechanical precision. I unlocked the screen and opened the application. The dashboard loaded, presenting 3 separate holding files requiring my review. I tapped the first file, accessing Tyler's monthly submission. The document viewer rendered a scanned copy of a standardized W-2 pay stub. The corporate logo belonged to the regional logistics center where he now worked. I reviewed the itemized columns. Tyler had logged 43 hours during the previous week. He had worked the early morning shift operating a forklift on a cold warehouse floor. There was a subtle irony in his current predicament. Our grandfather built his entire fortune starting in a similar warehouse, hauling freight and building a legacy through relentless physical labor. Tyler, who believed he was too refined for honest work, was now forced to retrace Richard's original footsteps just to survive. The pay stub verified his continuous employment. He was earning his existence. I closed his file and opened Susan's directory. My mother had uploaded a series of digital receipts covering her municipal utilities and basic provisions. I scrutinized a heating bill for the Oak Brook estate. The dollar amount was substantial. The contractors had departed the property 6 months prior, leaving the main floor exposed to the elements. Living inside a partially demolished mansion during the encroaching Illinois winter required a significant volume of natural gas just to keep the pipes from freezing. She was learning the true cost of maintaining the aristocratic illusion she prized above all else. Her grocery receipts reflected a stark departure from her previous habits. The artisanal cheeses and imported wines were replaced by bulk pantry staples and generic brands. She was budgeting her strict allowance, navigating the checkout aisles with a calculator instead of a premium credit card. The final folder belonged to Brittany. My younger sister had submitted a modest ledger of her own expenses. Following the cancellation of her extravagant Caribbean wedding, her wealthy fiancé had quietly broken their engagement, unwilling to tether his social status to a family experiencing a dramatic financial downgrade. Brittany was currently leasing a small one-bedroom apartment in the distant suburbs. She had secured an administrative position at a local dental office. The receipts she uploaded were unremarkable, reflecting a quiet, highly restricted lifestyle, devoid of the luxury vacations and designer wardrobes she once considered a birthright. I reviewed all 3 files. The documentation aligned perfectly with the parameters of the productive behavior clause. There were no hostile text messages demanding more money. There were no defamatory social media posts crying for public sympathy. The threat of total disinheritance had effectively rewired their psychology. They had submitted to the audit. I tapped the green authorization icon at the bottom of the screen. A small checkmark appeared confirming that my digital signature was applied to the release forms. The private bank would now dispatch their minimal stipends. The entire review process took less than 4 minutes. I locked my phone and set it back on the table. Sitting in the crisp morning air, I realized something profound had shifted within my own chest. For years, the mere thought of my mother's demands or my brother's cruel jokes would trigger a knot of anxiety in my stomach. When I first uncovered their plot to steal my condo, that anxiety transformed into a sharp, searing anger. But staring out at the sun reflecting off the lake, I felt no anger. I felt no residual bitterness. I did not hate them anymore. Hate requires emotional energy. It requires you to actively care about the target of your resentment. My family had simply ceased to matter enough to warrant that expenditure. They were no longer the looming architects of my misery. They were just distant variables in a closed equation. The true resolution of this conflict did not end with their subjugation. It ended with a quiet, astonishing reallocation of the Patterson fortune. During my last meeting with David Vance, we conducted a thorough review of the holding company's trajectory. Because my family was restricted to nominal stipends, the primary trust was retaining millions of dollars in surplus capital. The commercial assets and stock portfolios continued to generate massive quarterly dividends. The wealth was accumulating at a staggering rate, sitting idle in corporate accounts. I refused to let Richard's legacy gather dust while my relatives learned how to clock into a shift. I utilized my authority as the sole trustee to draft a new initiative, working alongside the internal legal team at Harrison Wealth Management. I established the Richard Patterson Caregiver Endowment. It is a fully funded philanthropic trust designed exclusively to support unpaid family members who sacrifice their careers to care for elderly or terminally ill relatives in the state of Illinois. The endowment issues robust financial grants to cover mortgages, utility bills, and medical debts for the quiet people who do the exhausting invisible labor I performed for 5 years. The irony is perfect. The sprawling fortune Susan and Tyler believed they would use to purchase Italian marble and European sports cars is currently paying the rent for exhausted daughters and weary grandsons across the Midwest. The greed of my family inadvertently financed the salvation of hundreds of devoted caretakers. I picked up my coffee mug, taking a long, slow sip. The dark roast tasted rich and grounding. The ledger was finally balanced. The errors were identified, isolated, and permanently corrected. If you are the dependable one in your own family, the quiet person who keeps the lights on while everyone else takes the credit, remember this story. Do not mistake your reliability for an obligation to endure abuse. You hold the receipts. You possess the power to stop signing your name to their entitlement. The day you finally open the books and force them to read the true cost of their behavior is the day you reclaim your life. Thank you for spending your evening with Calm Senior Stories. Share this narrative with anyone who needs the courage to balance their own accounts. Drop a comment with your thoughts and hit subscribe so we can continue finding the truth hiding in the numbers. There is a specific kind of exhaustion reserved for the dependable child. In American culture, we are often sold a conflicting script. We champion the self-made individual, the one who pulls themselves up by their own bootstraps. Yet we simultaneously demand endless silent sacrifice under the banner of family. We gather around holiday tables and pose for perfect portraits, hiding the unequal division of emotional and financial labor behind strained smiles. We are taught that blood is thicker than water, but we rarely discuss what happens when that blood acts like a slow leak, quietly draining your reserves while you pretend not to notice the chill. Jenna's journey is not just a tale about a legal trust, a corporate bank, or a Midwestern logistics empire. It is a mirror held up to the quiet corners of our own lives. For years, she played the assigned role perfectly. She organized the complex medical bills, absorbed the dismissive remarks, and watched her siblings chase the glittering illusion of success while she managed the gritty reality of their foundation. We have all sat at that mahogany table in one form or another. We have all waited for the acknowledgement that never comes, hoping that if we just carry the burden a little longer, the people we love will finally see our worth and offer a hand to help carry the load. But the core lesson hiding within the crisp ink of those manila folders is that you cannot purchase respect with your own suffering. Entitlement is a bottomless well, no amount of quiet endurance will ever fill it. The turning point arrives not with a dramatic shouting match, but with a sudden stark clarity. It is the moment you stop waiting for a miraculous apology and start treating the dynamic like a strict audit. When you strip away the emotional theater, the mathematics of a one-sided relationship are remarkably simple. You are either funding their illusion, or you are funding your own peace. Jenna chose her peace. She stopped trying to teach them empathy and simply rewrote the rules of engagement. She transformed the chaotic noise of her family into a predictable process, proving that the most profound boundaries do not require you to raise your voice. They only require you to walk away from the negotiation table. If you have ever found yourself holding up the sky for people who only ever complain about the shade, you are not alone. These are the narratives we gather to share the moments where quiet endurance finally transitions into unshakable power. If this realization resonates with the chapters of your own life, I encourage you to subscribe and follow our channel, Calm Senior Stories. Join a community that understands the true cost of being the reliable one. We are here to listen when you are ready to open the book. As the sun rises over the city and the dust settles on the empty chairs of that boardroom, a lingering question remains. When you finally sever the strings of expectation, when the frantic phone calls stop and the demands fade into nothing, what is left in the quiet? You trade the familiar heavy weight of their lives for the unfamiliar lightness of your own. It takes time to learn how to breathe in a room where no one is asking you to fix anything. You might look at the empty spaces in your life and wonder if the silence is a victory or a quiet exile. Perhaps in the end it is simply the sound of a ledger finally resting at zero.